We've all played games where we went from playing every day to realizing you haven't hopped on in weeks and didn't even notice. But what causes this change, and how long do the good times really last? Today, we're going to be going over the factors that make up the lifespan of single-player and multiplayer video games and try to determine how long each type will spend in the public eye and continue selling copies. All games, no matter the genre, have a similar life cycle that shows their growth and decline over time. This cycle is split up into 6 pieces, which we will call the hype, the release, the growth, the peak, the decline, and the death. The names themselves are relatively self-explanatory, but the hype covers all marketing and excitement prior to the game's actual release, whether these are closed beta tests, advertisements, or pre-release hype videos. This section has the most variation, either being almost non-existent or incredibly long. The release will surround the early time frame of the game coming out, whether that is the first week or the first month. This is going to be how the game is received immediately and will set the tone for the rest of the game's lifespan. The growth is where the cycle begins to get sort of hazy. From the end of the release up until the peak is the time the game consistently gets new, active players and gains more and more momentum. The peak is the singular point where the game has the most concurrent players and most buzz surrounding it, and we often don't know when the peak occurs until after the fact and we are able to look back over the full life of the game. The decline follows the peak, and this is when the player base begins to dwindle, losing consistent players week by week as people begin to lose interest and move on to other games or activities, despite attempts to keep it afloat with either marketing or updates. The death of a game is marked by a distinct lack of new players, with little marketing or attempts from the developer to stem the flow of players out of the game. While the life cycle of games always follows the same general path, the length of time spent and overall change in player numbers in each stage differs between factors such as the different types of game, whether it's part of a series, how frequent and how large the updates are, if any, and whether or not there's a continuous support from the game's community through modding the game that causes the actual lifespan of each genre to have significant differences. The first type of game we're going to be going over will be single-player, story-based video games. You can see these kinds of titles like The Last of Us, Sekiro, Detroit Become Human, and God of War, and these kind of games tend to have differing time frames in the hype section, depending on the kind of support they get prior to their release. In addition, single-player games' tail end of the life cycle tends to look a little bit different because it is rare for them to receive consistent updates, and their peak is when the most units are sold following the end of their release portion, rather than when it has the most actual players. What I mean by the kind of support that they receive, though, is that some AAA titles will receive immense support from the publisher in the form of advertisements and reveals at gaming conventions well in advance for some highly anticipated games. Smaller projects may receive little to no advertisement at all in comparison. It is this difference that can affect the distinct successes of some games, and the comparative failures of others. When a game gets revealed at E3 ahead of time, people will get excited and have it in the back of their minds even after the game is released, and they have all but forgotten about it, leading to a larger amount of early growth, while a game that is released without a word will have a smaller amount of initial growth and will likely rely on word-of-mouth spread to become popular. A good example of 2 games that became popular through both of these methods are God of War for the PS4, which was announced at E3 in June of 2016, and didn't get released until April of 2018. This allowed for nearly 2 full years of hype to build up before its release, and led to a huge success right out of the gates. The other game is Disco Elysium, released in October of 2019 with little to no fanfare, and became an immediate success, receiving universal acclaim and receiving reviews that said things like it set new genre standards for exploration and conversation systems. While there is so much difference in the amount of time spent hyping up these games, and it may affect the initial sales at the release phase of each title, the hype doesn't always affect the amount of time spent in the growth phase of the life cycle. The release phase for most types of games can last anywhere from 1 week to 1 month, and single-player games are no different. Depending on how long in advance the hype building started, this can change. But as a whole, most anticipated single-player games will experience their biggest spike in growth within the first few weeks of their release. The number of units sold during this period and how much time it is spent in the forefront of the public's mind will change considerably if the title is part of a series rather than a standalone game. As many gamers who may have missed the hype period will pick up a new title for a series they love, no matter what they have heard about it prior to its release. Many single-player games have their growth phase continue for around 5 to 6 months following the hype surrounding their initial release. Taking a look at Sekiro Shadow Dies Twice sales numbers, the game sold 2 million units in the first 10 days of its release due to the initial hype, but following that, it took another 5 months to sell an additional 2 million units by mid-August of 2019. This is a perfect example of the growth phase, as while Sekiro's initial hype had died off, the game continued to grow at a steady rate before beginning to taper off in the end of 2019. It was this tapering that indicated that Sekiro had already hit its peak of sales, and had moved into the decline phase by the time 2020 rolled around, as it took nearly another full year for Sekiro to sell an additional million units by July of 2020. The decline phase of the life cycle is hard to pinpoint due to some outliers, but typically this time period will last around 2 to 3 years. This is the time when the hype has died off, most people who had wanted to play the game have already completed and shelved it, and the only potential market left are those who had been waiting for the game to go on sale, or those who just pick it up because the box art looks neat in the bargain bin. This phase can be extended through either the release of DLC, the release of Game of the Year editions for well-received games, or continued marketing. But as a whole, the game is past its prime at this point, and won't be breaking any records anytime soon. One outlier that needs to be addressed in this section, however, is games that are released on new platforms or those with avid modding communities like Skyrim. This was released in late 2011 and continues to sell copies even today. The game was released, saw a dip in sales, then a DLC was released, creating more hype surrounding the game. Then the modding community became active, allowing for players to alter their games in ways that made it feel brand new again. Then it was released and re-released on newer consoles to drive sales even further, causing Skyrim to have a staggering 7-year-long decline phase. Now, I'm not saying every game developer should follow Bethesda's lead and try to keep a game from dying as long as possible, but you've got to admit it's impressive. Next we have the death, the time when few, if any, new players are beginning the game for the first time. After the games have been plucked from the bargain bins of the remaining GameStops and Targets, and the only way to find a copy is either buying it secondhand or going through eBay or an obscure Amazon store from Montenegro. Game death comes after all the other phases of the life cycle, and is the final stop for any games, usually happening 3 to 4 years after a game's initial release if it had no hype whatsoever, and 4 to 5 years following a huge announcement. Games that are either coming up on the stage or are already there as of mid-2020 are Dying Light, Evolve, The Last Guardian, and Quantum Break, which were some of the top games from 2015 and 2016, and even still there are so many more games that had less critical acclaim or publisher support than them to keep them moving through the decline phase. This leads us to believe that the life cycle for a single-player game is around 5 years, give or take. But that's just for single-player games that historically haven't received many updates or much support. What about online multiplayer games? Well, one main difference between single-player and multiplayer games is that, apart from AAA titles, predominantly online video games do not receive nearly the same amount of hype that single-player games do. They will occasionally be announced ahead of time, but more commonly, the hype period for online games lasts just weeks or months compared to the sometimes multiple years that single-player title games will get. This is believed to be due to the volatility of online games. When even the publishers don't always know what will become popular and what will not, this can lead them to choose not to divert a significant amount of resources to advertising ahead of time for what could possibly be a flop. This phase typically includes closed betas for server testing, and developers will reach out to popular streamers and content creators for advertising the game, rather than creating things like hype trailers and traditional advertisements, which are very costly. Similar to all other game types, the release phase lasts a few weeks following the game actually appearing in stores, real or virtual. This is the phase where it begins to become apparent whether this game will be an explosive success or will end up going unappreciated. Depending on the amount of hype created, this phase can either see rapid, immediate growth like we saw with Apex Legends, which reached over 50 million players within its first month, or it could see a smaller initial player count with later growth occurring like we saw with Dead by Daylight. The growth phase is where multiplayer games typically begin to really pick up steam, and depending on updates is highly variable. Due to the nature of online multiplayer games to be picked up and dropped at a moment's notice, however, these games typically have a shorter growth period if no further updates are provided, and their peak will usually occur between 6 months and a year following release. Gamers who play multiplayer games typically do so not only because the game is fun, but also because they have the ability to play with their friends. This leads to massive growth early on in the game's lifespan, but an equally steep drop-off once players start to move on to the next big thing. Players will attempt to bring their friends in to try the cool new game they found, and then after one player stops enjoying it as much, then the next one loses motivation to continue playing, and then the next, and then the next. It is this volatility, however, that causes multiplayer games to become such wild successes in the first place. And once the game peaks and players start leaving, there are many more options available to the developers to slow down the decline than there are for single-player games. Once the decline starts, the options available to the developers to try to delay the inevitable death of the game they worked so hard to create typically consist of adding DLC, creating new game modes, creating special events to draw back in players who have quit, releasing the title on new platforms, and making patches to the game to alter aspects to better fit what many would believe is a good game. This is so different from a single-player game, because with multiplayer-focused titles, players have come to expect patches and updates to keep the game fresh, challenging, and fun, and this can cause the decline to stretch for months or even years further than it would for a game that doesn't implement regular changes. You can see the most obvious example of this in the current gaming giant Fortnite, and how despite being released more than 3 years ago, retains its top spot as one of the most popular video games of all time. Outside of this outlier, however, the decline in multiplayer games will typically last multiple years, where the player bases dwindle and eventually the servers become a ghost town. The death of a multiplayer game is always a sad thing to realize. Reminiscing about time spent playing a game with friends and hopping on to try to get it going again just to find the servers have shut down will always tug on the heartstrings. But for online games, it typically takes 5 to 6 years before the developer will stop supporting the servers these games were played on. This is the point where it begins to be too costly to pay for the servers these games run on when compared to the players who are still using them. Overall, the official life cycle of an online multiplayer game from hype to death is this 5 to 6 year period. But from an online gamer's perspective, the actual life is much, much shorter than that. Once the decline hits a tipping point, and there aren't any friends left who still want to play the game, usually a couple years after release, the game is effectively dead, and the decline just begins to speed up more and more. People who joke about something being a dead game are often referring to this tipping point, and are trying to predict when the decline will be happening at a rate that makes the game's death imminent, which usually happens starting 1 to 2 years after the game's release. So from the factors we've gone over, we can see that while the actual death of each game occurs after around the same amount of time, single-player games retain their value until the day you can't find copies anymore, while multiplayer games die once you lose the ability to find people to play with. This leads us to believe that the death of single-player games happens around 5 to 6 years after release, while most multiplayer games will bite the dust within a year or two. There are many outliers, of course, but looking at gaming trends, this is the time frame most titles follow. So you better appreciate the games you're playing while you can, because you never truly know when the good times are until they're gone. As always, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you later.